authors of eyewitness events made themselves look foolish because they had actually behaved foolishly. Why would anybody who is desiring to trick people or to have them send in their tithes so that they can receive some sort of tchotchke so that they could fly around on a private jet? Okay, I'm getting my centuries confused, but you get the point. A charlatan tries to make himself look wonderful. The eyewitness accounts you read in the New Testament, they didn't look so stellar.
Tonight we're going to be taking a look at Todd Friel. I think that's how you pronounce his name. Anyways, he comes from the channel called Wretched. Originally, I thought that it was called Wretched. I must have some kind of undiagnosed dyslexia or something like that, because I feel like that's what that is. But anyways, he comes from a channel called Wretched, and they do a lot of Christian apologetics, and they're pretty much just geared towards helping the general believer. We're going to be taking a look at Todd tonight. He's going to try to convince us that Christianity is real. Just to preface, I know that Christianity is real in the sense that it really exists, like as a religion, but I think what he's really talking about here is the truth of Christianity. He's going to be teaching us how to convince atheists of the truth of Christianity. So if you heathens want to fuck around and find out the truth of Christianity, then please stay tuned. What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims in order to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. All right, so apparently the full episode's on the website. If you want to go, I wouldn't suggest going, but you know, whatever. Now, this video tonight, we're looking at Todd Friel. He's going to be trying to convince atheists that Christianity is true, that Jesus truly resurrected from the dead, and not necessarily that we should become Christian, maybe, but just that we should accept that Christianity is true and we're wrong. I guess that's what he's going to be doing tonight, and I guess we'll just get right on into it.
What other holy book would be as honest as Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 when he said, if this event didn't happen, forget about it? I'm paraphrasing, of course. I
don't know why that's a measure of how truthful it is. I mean, that's just Paul talking out of his ass. Right? Like, I don't get why it should be convincing to anybody. I mean, basically what Paul is saying here is that, oh, well, if this didn't happen, then there's really no point in Christianity. And I mean, I would have to agree that unless Jesus died for sins, there's no point in Christianity. But that doesn't mean that it's true. It just means that Paul believes it. You can believe things that are not true. Starting right off the bat in the first 13 seconds, I don't see it getting any better than this.
The resurrection of Jesus Christ is the linchpin miracle in the Bible. Perhaps you're thinking, well, what about the incarnation? When Jesus Christ, God, became flesh, the problem with saying that's the linchpin miracle is you can't look at a baby and know that the miracle happened. You would say, well, his life testifies that he is God. I would agree to that. But the incarnation cannot really be observed, but the resurrection of Jesus Christ can, and it was.
No, it wasn't. All we have, like as far as independent accounts of things, the only thing that we have is Paul. And all Paul says is that he had hallucinations. And then he repeats this like creed that he got from others that were Christians before him, saying that, oh, well, first Jesus appeared to Cephas, and then he appeared to all these people, which that part could be an interpolation or a spelling error. But in any case, and he goes on this list of people that like saw the resurrected Jesus. But the point is that they saw a resurrected Jesus. So it was not like Jesus resurrecting, it was Jesus after he already resurrected. So we don't have any evidence of Jesus resurrecting, nor even being resurrected. We have evidence of most likely hallucinations that were occurring, that or people that were just mistaken, Or they could have been lying about it. I mean, I don't know. I would think that lying would probably be the least probable out of the other solutions that I proposed. But I mean, it's definitely possible and far more probable than Jesus actually resurrecting.
Your entire life, your eternity is riding on this miracle, but we need to do some math. How do we even know about this miracle? Well, there was a book written about it. It's called the Bible, and that means you and I are relying on some eyewitnesses to be telling the truth.
Okay, so yes, there's no eyewitnesses in the Bible to Jesus's resurrection. There's just fictional accounts of Jesus's resurrection. That's not the part that I want to focus on with that here. Typically, apologists will tell you, "Oh, the Bible's not just one book. It's multiple books that were just put together in a collection." In this particular section, he talks about the Bible as if it were written all at once, or that it was all of this stuff came together sort of at one time. He may not mean that. I may be just reading a little bit too far into it, but I do want to point out how the Old Testament scriptures existed long before Christianity started. And in fact, they were mined for information about Jesus. So you have to take that into consideration, as well as the fact that Paul was writing first in around about the 50s. He was writing between the 50s and the mid 60s. And then the Gospels were written after that, ranging from Mark in the 70s, like between 65 and 70 or so. Mark was being written. Typically, scholars would say at least after 70. You have Mark, and then Matthew was written in the 80s. Luke was written at least after 93 AD. And then John is most likely written in the 2nd century. And then you have other books that are written in that time span as well. These are all like coming from at different times. And the Bible that we know now, at least what we might recognize as the Bible, wasn't actually cobbled together until about the mid 2nd century. So you have to understand that it was far on into Christian history before this Bible was actually put together.
How do we know? You'll hear this slanderous accusation when you witness on university campuses. Well, other books get people to believe a lie. There's people who have been charlatans. What about Jim Jones? Valid point, but that is why we need to dig deep into these eyewitness biblical accounts. And what we are going to see is something unique from every other myth story. Let's dive in to our eyewitness accounts to see if indeed they are something that can be trusted.
Okay, so before he gets into his evidence for the Gospels being eyewitness accounts or that they can be trusted, like I laid out before, the Gospel authorship is a bit awkward. So as far as the gospel goes, there's really only one gospel that can be considered somewhat pseudo-independent, and that would be Mark, because he was the first gospel written. But more importantly, Mark's gospel is what seeded all of the other gospels. Matthew's gospel copied from Mark. Luke's gospel copied from both Matthew and Mark, and then John's gospel used all three of those in order to generate his gospel. But even then, I say that Mark is pseudo-independent because he's not really independent. Mark used Paul's writings in order to generate a lot of his information about Jesus, about his theology, about what Jesus said and did. So you have to take all that into consideration when you're thinking about these as eyewitness accounts. That, for one thing, they can't be eyewitness accounts. If you are directly copying off of another person's work, you are not, one, independent, and two, an eyewitness. Eyewitnesses don't have to copy off each other in order to get the story straight, okay? They if they're really eyewitnesses, then they should just tell their story. Mark himself, being that he copied off of Paul, and the fact that he doesn't cite any sources also means that he's not an eyewitness. He wasn't written by an eyewitness. It wasn't like dictated by an eyewitness or anything like that. Mark contains no citations of sources. The only time that they mention some other work is when they're referencing scripture as where they got their information from. And that happens a lot throughout Mark, but it's most prevalent in Matthew's gospel. And so you really have to understand why it's ridiculous that the gospels are eyewitness accounts. There are no sources that they mention where they get their information from. They have information in those gospels that nobody else should be able to have. Like nobody should be able to like what happened in the Garden of Gethsemane. Nobody was around Jesus. Nobody knows what happened when Jesus went into his corner and prayed to himself. Nobody knows. Nobody should know, at least. So it's just it's situations like that, or like what happened out in the desert when he was tempted by Satan or whatever, and he sat in that ring for 40 days and 40 nights or whatever in the fuck he did. Who was there to write all that shit down? Who? No. Oh, that's another thing. The disciples were illiterate peasant people. They could not afford to learn to read and write. They could speak Greek because that was the general language of the area, but there's no way that they could have went to school and learned how to write in Greek and all this other shit. So they definitely didn't write those accounts. Just keep in mind all of the problems surrounding considering the Gospels to be eyewitness accounts.
From Nathan Booznitz, the written eyewitness accounts were in circulation much too early to be a myth.
I disagree with this, obviously. But if you just look at the situations that we have now in our socio-political sphere, you have this myth of tampering with the 2020 election. And people believe it, even though we can directly show them there was no tampering. There was no election fraud. People are still going to believe that there was election fraud. And it's become so normalized to believe in this myth now that you have people, celebrities or otherwise smart people saying that there was election fraud. So I don't know what it means when you say that it just happened too early to be a myth. Like these things were written down too early to be a myth. Maybe he'll explain. But just what I've seen in the recent past about this particular topic leads me to the conclusion that people will believe crazy shit if they want to. So it could definitely arise quick. A more academic answer would be look at cargo cults or look at Luddites. Thank you so much there, Robert. I saw, and thank you, honey, for pointing that out. The Luddites, their founder was completely mythical. Ned Ludd never originally existed. But also, if you just look at religions at the time in the first century, at the time of Jesus, you have several cults out there that were built off of mythical things. Another good point here is that UFOs developed in less time than it took the Gospels to develop in a mythical way, being that it's completely fiction. The stuff that happened in Roswell, by the 70s, it had blossomed into a full-fledged mythical story. In less time than it took for the Gospels to be written, there are now UFO abductions and crop circles and all this other shit and aliens found at a crash site in New Mexico. So you can't sit there and say, oh, these were written down too early to be a myth. I don't think so. Especially when you consider the fact that they pretty much made up all the information. It kind of makes it look like they were just pulling shit out of their ass. Or, well, they were pulling shit out of other people's asses and then mixing in their own shit with it. Casey said this is getting gross.
This is huge. Why? Because if they had been written much later, all that time, people could have concocted stories. But when the eyewitness accounts were written near the event, there are people who could have busted the authors. Hey!
Hey, that's what I was going to say. Hey, that's bullshit. There's no way anybody could have refuted this thing. But also, this particular point makes it sound like there weren't people that were already trying to argue against Christianity. I'll give you a good example of this. So in Mark's gospel at the very end, he has Jesus, or not really Jesus, but an angel appearing to the women at the tomb saying, "Oh, Jesus ain't here. Go home, bitches, and don't speak a word of this to anybody." And so they run away. And that's the original ending to Mark, which we may get into the longer ending to Mark and how that got tacked on in the mid-2nd century. But for right now, that's really all that you need to know. Well, in Matthew's gospel, what does he do? He invents Roman soldiers at the tomb. And this was all to stave off the anti-apologetic argument, or the anti-Christian argument that like the body was just stolen. Like the disciples just went in there and stole the body, because the original gospel doesn't have any Roman guards at the tomb. Matthew, upon hearing this particular argument against Christianity, was like, "Oh, no. There were guards at the tomb, and they were trained Roman ninjas. Okay, you couldn't get past these motherfuckers." When the women got there, the Roman soldiers were knocked on their ass, throwing stars and spears in hand, and the stone was there. And actually in Matthew, you've got an angel that comes down and knocks and bitch slaps the stone away, and then is like, "He ain't here, bitches," and then he rises back up into heaven. The fact is, though, is that Matthew's gospel records one of the earliest arguments against Christianity and this notion that Jesus resurrected from the dead. So to say that these were just written too early for people to start to refute, I feel like there's plenty of evidence in the differences between the gospels to show us that people were already arguing against it. Just because the later Christians didn't preserve any of the anti-Christian writing doesn't mean that it didn't exist. And it's very obvious that people were saying it due to the differences that we have. So it would be actually kind of odd if there weren't some kind of anti-Christian writings that were out there that just weren't preserved by Christians. That's happened multiple times as we've seen in what does exist now.
He didn't rise from the dead. Everybody in Jerusalem knows that, but our eyewitness accounts were written close enough to the actual events. And guess what? Nobody said, "You're fibbing," more details on the nearness of the accounts. A myth cannot be developed when people who can refute it are still alive.
This assumes a few things. One, that there weren't people that were saying that this is horseshit. We don't know if there were or weren't people saying that it was all horseshit. We definitely know that there were at least people making arguments against the Christians by the 80s. So, we do know that. Saying that a myth cannot develop when people can still refute it, that's refuted by our current sociopolitical environment right now. We have ways of refuting election fraud, but people are still believing in it. So to suggest that a myth cannot develop when there are people to refute it, I think is just horseshit. And you can look at any of the other things that I mentioned, like the cargo cults, that was easily refutable, but people still believed it. Ned Ludd, there were people around that could have refuted that, but they didn't, and instead they believed it. And then, you had the various things that are definitely fictional from the past, where, people could have refuted it. Either they didn't, or people believed it even though they were proven wrong. So this point number one right here doesn't really make a lot of sense, and he doesn't provide any kind of citations on where he's getting this from or anything like that. If you look at actual studies on myth and how they propagate through their cultures and everything like that, I feel like you would definitely find contrary evidence to what this number one point is trying to make.
Number two, many witnesses were still alive when Paul wrote 1 Corinthians in about AD 55, give or take.
So for that number two right there, he's saying that there were many witnesses still alive. Basically, that's just Paul saying that many of these people are still alive, although some have died, is what he says right there. And you can't tell me who he's talking about. Like, you can't give me names. You can't give any kind of meaningful information where I would be able to try to find any information on these people. The only time they're mentioned is vaguely in this particular part of 1 Corinthians. So, or 1 Corinthians, however you say it. This doesn't actually prove that there were actually many witnesses. It just shows that there were claims of many witnesses. But just because people believe there were a lot of witnesses doesn't mean there actually were witnesses. Like, if I were to say right now that, oh, hey, look, guys, Saturday night, Meatloaf is going to play a concert in Huntsville, Alabama. I know he's dead, hun. That's the reason why I picked him. Let's say last night there was a Meatloaf concert in Huntsville, Alabama. 500 people attended. We all saw Meatloaf live on stage singing, I would do anything for love, but I won't do that. No. Meatloaf is on stage singing it. 500 people in Huntsville, Alabama saw it. Find those 500 people. Right? I mean, you should be able to, right? I mean, it doesn't matter where you're at in the world. There are people watching right now that are probably from North Alabama. Go find those 500 people. And if you can't find those 500 people, does that mean that those 500 people don't exist? That 500 people didn't witness Meatloaf singing that he would do anything for love? That's true, honey. 500 people didn't. But my point is that at that point in time, you would not be able to find these 500 witnesses that are unnamed. Paul doesn't give us any kind of indication of where they were when they saw Jesus. So there would be no way. Like, I gave more information about Ghost Meatloaf singing his song in Huntsville, Alabama than Paul gives in this little shitty statement in 1 Corinthians.
3. Many witnesses were still alive when Paul wrote Galatians in AD 49.
I don't know what he's talking about here. Paul does not mention any witnesses. He doesn't indicate anybody is a witness. He talks about Cephas and James, one of the pillars, but those were just people that received visions of Jesus. So they're not eyewitnesses of him resurrecting from the dead. They're just people who had hallucinations. So this point right here is just false. Like, it's, I'm not going to say that he's lying about it, but if he were to try to spin Galatians to be about eyewitnesses or witnesses in general, I would definitely say that that's disingenuous because he knows that that's not what Paul says.
He certainly talks about Christ rising from the dead. Number 4. A myth requires 2 or more generations to pass before it can take root.
No, I don't like where does this come off? A myth requires 2 or more generations to pass before it can take root. Where in the fuck does this come from? All it takes is the ignorance of people and not knowing like everything that happened in the first century. I mean, just think about it. If you're walking around the 70s and you have some fuck saying that like 40 years ago somebody died for your sins, I mean, how are you going to verify that? In fact, I feel like this guy gets a lot of things backwards in this entire video, but in this particular part, what I feel like he gets backwards is actually that myth can propagate faster in a time when people aren't connected, when the literacy rate is abysmal, like near nothing, at least compared to what the literacy rate is now. Myth would be able to propagate much faster, and it would be able to take root quicker at that point in time than now. Because you think about it, right now, we have people that are spreading myths about, well, for one thing, election fraud. And then you've got other things like the anti-vax stuff. That's something new that I haven't talked about yet instead of the election fraud stuff. The anti-vax stuff, that stuff has been around for multiple years and it still hasn't gone away. In fact, it's actually grown since COVID. Yeah, I wish we could go back to the time when we would laugh at anti-vaxxers and blame them for like diseases.
And finally, number 5. The best scholarship suggests the synoptic gospels were written within 30 years of Calvary.
That's the most conservative date, because if you figure that Jesus was supposedly crucified in the early 30s, the earliest date for like Mark's gospel being 65, that's relatively within that 30-year margin that he's talking about. But a closer approximation to it would be 40 years, right around 40 years plus or minus some years. I mean, we don't have exact dates for any of this, but also I don't know what this has to do with being able to trust Christianity. Myths can definitely develop in shorter amounts of time. Even by his conservative estimate here, the UFO scene, like the UFO, that whole community popped up in 20 years. How can you seriously think that myths and false information can't take root before the 30-year mark right here, which is an incorrect number, but still, even using his number, it's ridiculous.
All that to say, The people who wrote these accounts claim to have seen them.
Big whoop-de-fucking-do. I really don't care if they claim to have seen anything. I can claim to see a big dick dinosaur flying in the sky, but that doesn't mean that one exists.
Furthermore, the details that are given are so rich. Anytime somebody makes up a myth, you see, this guy he died and then he wasn't dead anymore, and they can be extremely vague. Why? Because you can't get...
You know, honey, I can't think of a more vague story than fucking Robin Hood or King Arthur. Can you think of a more vague story? Oh, well, there's this, was he a fox? He might have been a fox. He was living in the woods, and he went and fought in the Crusades, and, then he got sent back for some fucking reason. And he come back and he was really pissed off at the law. And so he fucked around with the law a little bit, and then he married a princess. That's Robin Hood. Is that really an accurate representation of Robin Hood? I just did exactly what he did to the Gospels here. Actually, I feel like I gave more information. You did. But my point stands is that it's ridiculous to say that fictional stories are vague. Who's going to pick up a fiction like narrative, like a novel or something like that? And it's like 3 pages long, and it's the vaguest story that you've ever heard. Nobody's going to read that book. In fact, fictional stories often have vastly more details than like historical accounts of things. Like, you're not going to know how many buttons were on, some general's shirt when he ordered the attack on bumfuck nowhere, right? But in a fictional story, you could talk about all 72 of his buttons quivered with the anxious anxiety of a terrorized duck or something like that. It's a good thing I don't write fiction. Fictional stories often have vastly more details than like historical accounts.
Busted, but when you've got a lot of details, that tells the reader, either they're a really intricate liar or this really happened from Nathan.
Okay, so first off, he's either a liar or they were telling the truth. Like, I've never heard such a blatant false dichotomy. It's not that they were lying. They could have truly believed that these are things that happened to Jesus. But just because they believe this happened to Jesus doesn't mean that it's actually true. And just because they can write a nice, pretty story around these events doesn't mean that it's false. So I feel like this is an argument that doesn't help either case, either that Jesus wasn't real or that Jesus was real, or his crucifixion happened or didn't happen. Like, I don't think that really helps us out in either case.
The Nebuznits, first century fiction was not written in today's style of realistic narrative. There is no mistaking ancient myth with real history, because ancient fiction never wasted time on unnecessary details that didn't drive the plot or promote a character's development.
How long is the Iliad? Yeah, the Iliad's kind of long. So going back to this slide right here, I'm wondering, can anybody name a detail in the Gospels that doesn't drive the plot or promote a character's development? What on earth in the Bible is in there that doesn't do one of those things? And even if it doesn't do one of those things, it could just be there for literary color, right? Like, it could just be there in order to make the story better. So I don't see how this point at all makes any kind of difference as far as whether or not the story's true.
Go ahead and read any one of the mythological accounts of some sort of divine human being, and they do not have the specificity of the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
How is it specific? Like, the resurrection of Jesus? How is that shit specific at all? Like, it's really not specific. Let me, actually, you know what I could do is I could bring up, Mark 16. Okay, so Jesus has risen. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of Jesus, and Salome brought spices that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, who will roll away the stone away from the entrance of the tomb? But when they looked up, they saw the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. Don't be alarmed! Shit. He called them out beforehand. He said, you are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. Go tell his disciples. He's going ahead of you to Galilee. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. I don't see this as having a lot of like descriptive stuff in it. He acts like it's very descriptive, but I don't think that we really get all that descriptive until, let's see, maybe John's account. Hold on. Let's see, the empty tomb. It gets a little bit more elaborate as John goes. Typically, the earliest source is going to be your most the one that's closest to if the events actually happened. That's going to be your best account for that. But as you see, as we get into the 2nd century with John, we have like an elaborate story being told. Using his criteria, that would mean that John's gospel is actually the more accurate one compared to Mark's gospel, who's a lot more vague. But in reality, what we have is by the 2nd century, the myth of Jesus and his resurrection being fully fleshed out, having a lot of different supporting details and not facts, but supporting detailed information and stuff. It's totally opposite as to what he's saying here.
In 4 accounts, that should give you confidence. This is too detailed from individuals who wrote the accounts too near the event for it to be a myth. More from Dr. Booznitz. Mark 4:38, he cites Jesus himself was in the stern asleep on the cushion, and they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?"
This is a really interesting thing that he brings up here. And it's interesting because if you read Randall Helm's Gospel Fictions, he actually painstakingly goes through all of the Gospels and points out all of the connections between the Gospels and the Old Testament. This particular story right here is about Jesus calming the seas, right? So Jesus and the disciples are on the boat. There's a sea, which doesn't make a lot of fucking sense because the sea that they're on is really just a big lake, right? Think the fucking Ozarks or something like that. Anyways, he calms the sea. The reason why this is worked in there is because of the book of Jonah. You see, Jonah is seen as a prefigure to Jesus Christ. In fact, Matthew actually says that there will be no sign that Jesus is the Messiah other than the sign of Jonah. The sign of Jonah is, him being trapped in a whale for 3 days. Jesus also likewise is dead for 3 days, and that Matthew explicitly makes that connection. Well, Mark right here is using the book of Jonah in order to generate this stilling of the seas or the calming of the seas in this storm. And the "teacher, do you not care that we are perishing" is linguistically similar and even directly lifting some of the phrases from the book of Jonah. In the book of Jonah, what you have is Jonah calling out to God, saying, "Oh, do you not care that we are about to drown?" and all this other stuff. And so God stills the seas. The disciples here are like the fishermen. In this particular section right here, I'm guessing that he's going to harp on some detail, and he's about to do that. My point in bringing up the Jonah thing, though, is the fact that it was mined from Jonah, and it was not at all like a historical event as far as we can tell. If you have to mine information from a book from the Old Testament in order to tell the story of something in the New Testament, then more than likely that event didn't actually happen.
He was in the stern on a cushion. Why the detail? Oh yeah, because they were there.
This is just an assumption here. It's speculation. You can't know that they were there. Also, this particular statement seems to suggest that the disciples, or some of the disciples at least, wrote or at least informed the Gospels, which we don't have any evidence of that happening. This right here could just be the author adding in some detail to explain the scene. I mean, when you're writing fiction, you're looking to paint a scene in the reader's mind. So my guess is that they wanted to do that, is painting a scene for the reader to envision. And I mean, who would want to sleep like on a hard floor of a boat. Like, I don't think that anybody would. I think that most of the time people would want to be sleeping on a cushion, or they would have at least some kind of padding there to sleep on. I really don't think Jesus would just be passed out on the deck of the ship. I think that he would be sleeping on something. So this isn't really an extra detail that doesn't need to be there.
And they knew the details. Verse number 2, that is an example, is John 21:8. But the other disciples came in the little boat, for they were not far from the land, but about 100 yards away, dragging the net full of fish. Or consider John 21:11. Simon Peter went up and drew the net to land full of large fish, 153. And although there were so many, the net was not torn. Who would know that there were 153 fish? Oh yeah, an eyewitness who is telling the truth, but there is more.
Why is that your direct go-to thing? Why can't this just be something that they made up? They could have just pulled a number out of their ass. Do you really expect that? With John being written in the 2nd century, do you really expect whoever wrote John to know that 153 fish were caught on that particular fishing expedition? Like, nobody's going to sit there and count the fish out that they caught in a net, okay? So this doesn't scream, oh, they were eyewitnesses. They knew it had to be there. It screams, I pulled this number out of my ass. We caught a shit ton of fish that day. And also, I would think that this would just drive with the point that there were so many fish in the net and the net was not torn. This is advancing some kind of plot point or message or character development. It's matching what he said before about how this is an inconsequential detail.
Or reliability to the eyewitness accounts. The written eyewitness accounts are too self-debasing and counterproductive to be a myth.
Okay, this is the criterion of embarrassment, and it really doesn't work for any kind of thing that you're trying to prove. For one thing, there's just as much reason to make shit up like this than there is for it to be true. The Gospels are notorious for painting the disciples as being idiots. And this is because the disciples are representative of the tribes of Israel, or the Israelite people. The Israelite people are dumb fucks in the Gospels, okay? They're dumb fucks in the disciples, and they're dumb fucks for putting Jesus on the cross, or at least forcing Pilate to put Jesus on the cross. So it would actually be weird if they weren't continuously painted as being dumb fucks. All throughout the Old Testament, you have Jesus telling the Israelite people, y'all are dumb fucks. That's why I hate you. But you're also my chosen people. This is not any kind of good evidence that the Gospels are true or they're relaying accurate history. It would actually be unexpected if the Gospels didn't paint the Israelite people as being dumb fucks.
Imagine you desired to be rich and famous and to have a lot of followers, and you were willing to write down details of your experiences following a poor Nazarene around Israel. Would you describe yourself as a buffoon?
A buffoon. And then he's got that disappointed dad look on his face. It amazes me that a Christian would be like, why would I want to represent myself as a dumbass? When in fact, that is like one of the central messages to Christianity, that humanity is a dumbass. Humanity needs a savior. Like, I feel like the message of Christianity would be lost on people if Christianity wasn't claiming like, hey, we're all dumb fucks. We all do dumb shit all the time, but that's why we need a savior. Like, is that not like kind of an integral part of Christianity? The painting humanity as this fallen, broken, and ignorant group of organisms that need somebody to save them. Like, I feel like everything that I've seen from Christian apologists, that's the message that I get, that we need saving. I posted up a clip from my discussion with Ben Shetler. He's like, oh, you just don't have the humility to admit that you deserve hell. I feel like if it weren't for the Gospels shitting on humanity or the Israelites in general, I really don't think that it would have a message that would make you believe in it. I feel like that's an integral part of it.
And yet that is exactly what we read all throughout the New Testament. Authors of eyewitness events made themselves look foolish because they had actually behaved foolishly. Why would anybody who is desiring to trick people or to have them send in their tithes so that they can receive some sort of tchotchke so that they could fly around on a private jet? Okay, I'm getting my centuries confused, but you get the point. A charlatan tries to make himself look wonderful. The eyewitness accounts you read in the New Testament, they didn't look so stellar.
Well, that's because they weren't lying about it. And also, like, the prosperity gospel dipshits that exist now are totally different from the original Christians that wrote the shit down, invented the myths and all that other stuff. I don't think that they were trying to lie to people to gain like power, prestige, or money or anything like that. I think that they were writing down things that they truly believed in. But as sincere as those beliefs are, I don't think that those beliefs are representative of reality, because you can believe in things that aren't real. And so that has no effect on whether or not Christianity is true. The fact that people wrote down what they believed happened. It's not what actually happened. It's just what they believe to have happened. Suggesting that it's either they're liars and con man versus it's truth is yet another false dichotomy.
8 examples of this. Number 1, John never mentioning his own name anywhere in his gospel, instead referring to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved.
Okay, before he moves on to the next one, this one is actually false. This is not what the scholarship says, and he's actually on the fringe of scholarship at this point. He's been on the fringe of it this entire video, but this one especially, because scholars has actually identified Lazarus in John's gospel as being the disciple whom Jesus loved. And that at the end of the gospel is not the person that wrote it, but the source of the information. So the person that wrote the Bible got the information from Lazarus, the disciple whom Jesus loved. So this is just fucking wrong on all fronts right here.
Trying to get rich, you don't do that. Number 2, Peter's courtyard failure at Jesus' trial, where he denied knowing Jesus 3 times.
3 is a magical number. Peter denying Jesus 3 times is a way to say that, oh, people will deny knowing Jesus and everything like that, but, in the end, you're consumed by the knowledge of Jesus. I feel like that's the ultimate message for that. Saying that he denies him 3 times, that's significant. 3 is a significant number, especially when you're talking about like God.
Number 3, the frequent bickering and pettiness among Jesus' closest disciples.
Again, representative of the Israelite people, them bickering amongst themselves, fighting amongst themselves. In this particular instance, the thing that I'm thinking about is fighting about who's the best disciple and all this other stuff, or who's the one that adheres to it the most. And like that kind of pride and that kind of stuff is exactly what the Old Testament God hated. And that's, in this situation, is also what Jesus hates.
They look like the Stooges. Number 4, Jesus never taking a side on political issues.
Well, I would not expect Jesus to take sides on political issues because, and I guess he's talking about like paying taxes maybe and stuff like that. But in any case, in the New Testament, there was this idea of a heaven or this kingdom that comes after this life. So Jesus wasn't focused on whatever in the fuck was happening like in the real world or anything like that as far as the gospels go. He was only concerned with his eternal kingdom that it only exists after this life. So it makes total sense that he wouldn't be concerned with like petty political squabbles. Also, Jesus being God himself, he's like, I make the rules, bitches. I don't know why y'all are even fretting about this shit.
5, Jesus asking the Father that he might be spared the cup of his suffering.
This right here happens in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus is pleading with his with God, and I do believe that this is actually, it's changed. Mark 14:32 through 32 through 42. Father, he says, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but you will. All right, so in Mark, Jesus is asking God to take this cup of suffering from him. Going a little farther, he fell on his face, and my Father's impossible, may this cup be taken from me. Okay, so it's the same in Matthew. Let's see what Luke says. Luke, we got Luke 22. Last Supper, Jesus prays on the Mount of Olives. Okay, so this is interesting. In Luke's gospel, he doesn't do this in the Garden of Gethsemane. He does this on the Mount of Olives, which is actually a bit closer to what the scripture says, because Scripture describes the Mount of Olives, and that's where a lot of things happen. So that's weird because Luke's gospel has it happening at the Mount of Olives. That's a big difference. Is a garden and Mount of Olives? I mean, I feel like those are two very different things. Agony in the garden. Wait, hold on. John 18. Let's see what John 18 says. Jesus arrested. That would be, there was a garden, Criterion Valley on the other side. There was a garden. It seems like John has removed this part altogether. See, Jesus prays for all believers. Jesus arrested. This is him going to the garden. And then immediately Judas, who betrayed him, Judas came to the garden. Jesus, what else says, who is it you want? Yeah, so it seems like John doesn't even have the Gethsemane story. Kind of interesting. This particular part isn't attested in the book of John. The other part, the other gospels have taken place in different locations. But the fact is that it showcases how Jesus accepts the suffering. Regardless of whether or not he asks for God to take the cup from him, it's to emphasize the fact that Jesus made the conscious decision to go through this suffering for people. So this is definitely advancing a plot point.
A tricky detail, number 6, Jesus asking the Father why he had forsaken him. 7.
See, that's one of the things that is kind of weird in Mark's gospel. It's like, why, God, why have you forsaken me? But that's also only occurring in one of the gospels. Like, Mark is the only gospel that has him saying that, and it doesn't make sense for him to say that. I don't see why that is on his point here of these uncomfortable things. There's a perfectly reasonable explanation for why Jesus would have said that. Mark's gospel is an adoptionist gospel. But the archangel that was the Messiah inhabiting that body, I think at that point it was just him being confused about all this. Maybe I mean I don't know, but the fact is that was meant to drive a story point, a plot point. Jesus being executed as a common criminal. I mean, how else was he supposed to be executed by the Romans in the first century? How else is he expecting Jesus to be handled?
Jesus being executed as a common criminal. And finally, an appeal to a woman's testimony, which in those days was not admissible in court.
So the fuck what? Like, I don't understand why this particular point is ever brought up. For one thing, this is not a court. For another thing, it's not that women's testimonies weren't admissible in court. In fact, they were admissible in court. It was just unseemly for a woman to appear in court. There's a big difference there. Women often gave testimonies either directly or through some kind of proxy, and we have evidence of this in like Josephus and other first century historians. So you can't just sit there and tell me that a woman's testimony wasn't admissible in court when they definitely were.
All of these details would not be included if it were a lie.
See, that's just speculation right there. I think that all of these details and more, which there are more details, but I think all of these details would be included even if they were lying. I think that if somebody was just making shit up, they would have made this shit up too. So all of these arguments and pieces of evidence are really neutral as to whether or not it proves that the Gospels are historical or are relaying accurate information. But all in all, I don't think that Todd's video here was all that impressive or persuasive. And I didn't really see anything that should, convince an atheist that Christianity is true. Everything that he mentioned has like a neutral effect on the question of whether or not Christianity is true or Christianity is real, as he would put it. And there was no real good argument that was given as to why any of that should convince an atheist to either become a Christian or to consider Christianity to be historical. So ultimately, what it boils down to is that Todd and Wretched, that particular organization, really heavily relies on the fringes of information concerning the Gospels in order to convince people that are already convinced of the position. So whenever they try to say, oh, hey, here's how you convince an atheist or somebody that doesn't believe, they still are giving these really shitty arguments that only believers will eat up. Only people that already believe the story you sold them are gonna believe it. I don't mean that as necessarily a knock against people that believe in Christianity, but as far as like something that should convince somebody that doesn't already believe. I feel like everything that was mentioned here is just not going to be convincing enough. What we want is actual evidence, not just speculation about some details or whatnot that was in a story. That is not evidence. That's just pulling shit out of your ass and acting like it's a gold brick instead of a brick of shit. If you will, please leave me a comment down below with what you thought about Todd's video here. I'd really love to hear what you guys think about the points that he brought up. Do you think that he had good points, or do you think that he was rather shitty? Let me know in the comments below what you thought. And while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button, because everybody wants to smash the like button. If you smash the dislike button, I won't know, so go right on ahead, I guess. It has no effect. After you're done smashing like or dislike, be sure to subscribe. And I guess I will see you heathens later. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.